What do you see founders struggling the most with then? What do they come to you most often with?
Yeah, I think at the stage that we're investing in, most often it's two things. One is hiring. Obviously, this is typically the time when most of them are building out their leadership teams. And it's not just the actual act of recruiting and finding people, it's also building the profile of who's the right type of person to bring in. And the second is on go to market strategy. As again, of the stage that we're investing in, usually our companies have some early signals of product market fit, but they haven't really started to build a repeatable, scalable engine.
How do you see AI helping with that, go to market or hiring, for example? So do you see now with, lots of AI solutions, does it get easier or harder for founders to, either hire or sell?
And I'll take the selling one first because we've spent a lot of time thinking about the go to market stack, and B2B sales has dramatically changed over the past 18 months. And what we're consistently hearing is
The Cloud Frontier podcast is brought to you by SimplyBlock. In this bi-weekly podcast, we explore cloud infrastructure startups, founder journeys, and discuss cutting-edge cloud technologies. Join us as we uncover the latest innovations shaping the future of cloud computing. It's like, is it the last thing you do before the holidays, or you still have a?
I have a couple more meetings today, and then it'll be the last thing I do. So pretty
Okay.
close.
Hopefully it's fun.
Yes,
And
definitely.
how did you end up in the VC world actually?
Yeah, it was a little bit serendipitous. I've been familiar with venture and the startup ecosystem for most of my life. My dad was an entrepreneur, so I always kind of saw his founding journey from a very young age. It was always something I was really interested in. So I went and studied computer engineering, thinking that that would be my foray into the startup world, that I would go build something. I interned at a few different startups, realized that the technical side wasn't quite for me, but I still really loved being around the founder ecosystem and helping founders and startups think about broader scaling strategy. And so, after a couple years in consulting, where I did some private equity work and got to do a little bit of transactional work as well, I started looking at venture opportunities. And I was living in Chicago at the time, and Jump had a lot of the characteristics that I was looking for in a firm. And so, again, pretty serendipitously, I landed there about 4.5 years ago.
So that's been quite a while. And how has that journey been for you so far? How's that? So that's your first VC experience, right?
Yes, this is my first venture experience. Again, I had a little bit of private equity exposure, but Jump has been my first venture firm.
And how has that been? Like what is the thing you like the most about your work, and maybe the thing that you like the least about being in the VC world?
Yeah, I think the thing that I like the most is honestly to be effective in this role, you just have to learn a lot of things. Like you have to be on the cutting edge of what's happening from a macro perspective, from a micro perspective across different sectors. I get to spend most of my days just talking to people who are a lot smarter than I am, namely founders, and learning what they're building. And that just gives me a really broad purview on um, how technology and businesses are evolving both within our country and at a global scale. And I've always been somebody who's very knowledge hungry. And so the idea of being in a role where having intellectual debates, constantly learning and challenging your perspectives drives how successful you can be here is really exciting and something that I'm very grateful for.
And the first thing that I think of is like, how often are you in a room when the founders really pitch to you something that you like just have absolutely no clue about? Because it must happen a lot of times, right?
It
Like
does.
no matter how smart you are, right?
No, yes, definitely. And I definitely don't know everything every founder is talking about. I'll say like Jump's approach is to be pretty thematic. That's how we believe not only can we make the smartest investments, but also be the most helpful to founders post investment, is if we really understand um, their industries at a pretty nuanced level and have a perspective on it. And that perspective might be wrong, but we do try to have most conversations with some type of point of view. So I'll say for me personally, it's less often than you might think just because we take that approach, but it certainly happens. I mean, there are lots of times we're talking about categories that I don't know, or my partners at the firm are bringing in deals in their categories of interest that I'm not smart about. And that's where we're typically relying on each other to say, okay, you're the fintech expert. Tell me what I need to know here and how I can actually evaluate this business. So there's a lot of collaboration that goes into being able to make smart decisions, in my opinion.
I think this approach makes a lot of sense, right? Because it also for the founders, and I can talk for myself. It's quite frustrating when you're sort of talking to a VC who's sort of generalist, and obviously as a generalist VC, you can understand a lot of things, but it's very hard for you to understand a very like point solutions or specific niche topics in specific verticals, right? And I think this approach works better as you described, at least from my perspective overall, right? Unless you really have like a really large team and you can always fall back onto someone who has some sort of domain expertise, right? But if you're not a super large fund, then probably being more topic oriented makes a lot of sense. And tell us about a bit more about Jump then. So for the audience who not necessarily know Jump Capital, like, well, what's the fund's history, like what do you invest in, etc.
Yeah. So Jump is about 12 years old now, early stage fund. Most of what we do is seed and Series A. And at a high level, we invest across three sectors. FinTech and financial services adjacent is a big portion of what we do. The rest is enterprise software, both application layer and infrastructure. And those two categories are where I spend a bulk of my time. I think the two kind of core pillars to know about Jump for working with us is one, as I mentioned, we're very thesis driven. So we do try to get really deep in sectors prior to investing in them. And that again drives how helpful we can be post investment, which is our second pillar. I think a lot of people say they are very founder friendly
Right.
these days. That's a messaging that's been inundated in the venture world, but it is really core to our ethos and who we are. Most of our team comes from operating backgrounds, and we have a very collaborative approach to operating. So while we do have a platform team, we don't make investments in companies and then hand them off to that team and say, okay, that's your go-to for whatever problem you have. We take a very collaborative approach so that whoever on our team is best suited to serve a founder's needs, whether that be a functional need, a domain related question, you have all of the Jump resources at your disposal in order to move that problem forward.
What do you see founders struggling the most with then? Like, what do they come to you most often with?
Yeah, I think at the stage that we're investing in, most often it's two things. One is hiring. Obviously, this is typically the time when most of them are building out their leadership teams. And it's not just the actual act of recruiting and finding people, it's also building the profile of who's the right type of person to bring in for this stage, for this type of organization, for who you're selling to. So, no two CROs are the same, for example. So, we do a lot of support in helping to profile what that right candidate could look like. So hiring is a different bucket, or is a big bucket, excuse me. And the second is on go to market strategy. So because again of the stage that we're investing in, usually our companies have some early signals of product market fit, but they haven't really started to build a repeatable, scalable engine. And that's again where you have questions around where do we invest our marketing dollars? How do we build pipeline? What type of resources do we need to hire? How should we project our sales plan for this year? And so there could be a whole number of strategic questions that are coming up or very granular tactical questions that are coming up. And that tends to be, again, where we spend a good chunk of our time with the companies that we invest in.
I mean, I can definitely relate to those things as well. I mean, those are definitely some of the hardest things, as a founder. And I think this go-to-market strategy is often why it's also so business specific that maybe it's again advantage that you sort of work with businesses, oriented around the same, maybe ecosystem of things, or at least in the same space, or where the go-to-market motion is a bit more sort of similar, right? While some of the companies might just have completely different approach, right, to things because they're just in completely different spaces, right? um, and obviously we're going to talk about AI a lot, but I think the first question that pops to my mind is, how do you see AI helping with that, go to market or hiring, for example? So do you see now with lots of AI solutions, does it get actually easier or harder for founders to either hire or sell?
That's a good question. I'll take the selling one first because we've spent a lot of time thinking about the go to market stack, and B2B sales has dramatically changed over the past 18 months. And what we're consistently hearing is what used to work doesn't work anymore. And
Right.
what's old is new again. And so things like conferences and
Yeah.
referrals and gifting has resurged. And I do think that AI has the capability to bridge a lot of the gaps that exist. However, I think what's happened is because these problems started to surface 12, 18 months ago, a lot of go to market leaders just threw dollars at solutions trying to figure out something that would work. And that's actually resulted in this huge proliferation across the stack of people, processes, and a bunch of different AI tools not working in cohesion. And so now I think what you're seeing is tools come out to help aggregate all of this data across all of the different systems and peoples that they live within and elevate those insights in a much more digestible, usable, quicker manner. And that's where I think AI is really powerful, right? And to take all of this different data, unstructured data, structured data, and make it queryable, make it digestible in a much faster fashion than go-to-market teams have typically, been able to achieve. Um, on the hiring side, same thing. I think hiring, there are more constraints or concerns from a regulatory perspective. I think hiring can get really dicey when you start to bring AI into candidate screening and resume screening. There's definitely a lot of companies trying to do it. I think that front end experience is a little bit harder to navigate today. And so we're also seeing some uncertainty. Where we are seeing AI be really powerful when it comes to candidate evaluation or talent evaluation is kind of on the skills assessment side. And so there's this whole shift in the talent industry of not assessing people on pedigree or experience set alone, but on actual skill sets. And that can be inferred from projects you do or things you've done in your past. And then you also have hard skills just based on, again, your experience set and things you learn. And so there's a lot of these interesting AI companies. We're actually invested in one, shameless plug, that are building these more complex knowledge graphs at an individual level, trying to assess all of the skill set that you have and then match that to a role either within an organization or at a new organization.
Right.
So I think that's where on the talent side, AI gets really interesting.
Right. So it's more of a screening process rather than really like discover, because the cool thing would be to really like discover people like more easily, right? Because typically, the best candidates you sort of find are not the ones that apply for your job, but either they're from your network, right? Or you like cold pitch them on LinkedIn, right? Because you like their profile, but like yeah, I guess there could be generally like a more of a better way to globally match that talent with the specific roles at the company, right? I think probably what you described is now like localized, meaning on the company level. On the company level, if you have a candidate, you can sort of match him or her better, right, with the role. But on the other hand, like ideally, you would also know whether this person is this the best company for that candidate, right? Because eventually, win-win is when sort of you as a startup or as an organization hire the right candidate, but also if the company is the right company for the candidate, right? And I think that's what might get much better over time, right? Because eventually you see that most of the people are sort of unhappy at their jobs, and maybe AI can sort of tackle that. So I'm also excited about this personally, because it's always a lot of time going into hiring. um, and so on the AI front, so obviously, I'm hearing that you've done some AI investments. So tell us more about it. How many of your recent investments were AI investments? Is it like 5 out of 5 recent investments is AI related, or like what's the ratio, and what's your thesis on that overall?
Yeah. So, trying to think. I think we've done 6 deals this year, but in the past 6 months, I'll just maybe talk to the ones that I've done. We've done four. Of those four, two are completely AI native. They're AI infrastructure plays, which we can talk to. One is an application layer software that's being enabled by AI, but it's not one of those companies that's going to market saying, hey, we're an AI company. It's just using specific AI capabilities to power their broader solution, which we can also talk about. And then one is actually not AI native at all. They're, of course, thinking about where AI comes on the roadmap, but I think it's an important point because there's still so many unsolved problems out there where
Right. I mean, that was one of my later questions. It's like, what if you're not building in AI? Like, do you still stand a chance?
yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of places where generative AI is not necessary or not trusted yet. So I was talking to this really interesting company in the application security space a couple weeks ago, where the Sneaks of the world and the Sonar Cubes, et cetera, all play, and they're trying to do automated remediation. So once a Sneak, et cetera, elevates your vulnerability scans from your code, they're trying to take that and generate a fix automatically. And most of these SaaS platforms do that already, but they're using generative models. And so what that means is every time there's a vulnerability, the suggested fix might be different. So it's really hard to remove a human from that remediation process because they have to check something every time. So that's a really good example of the company that I was talking to was using deterministic models and building a separate rule for every type of vulnerability they found. Of course, there's limitations to that, but where that becomes really interesting is humans can actually completely rely on auto remediation for certain types of vulnerabilities because they know for X vulnerability, Y fix will always be the same. So there are certainly places where we're not saying, okay, generative AI is the answer, and I think it requires a deeper level of scrutiny. But again, to your point, we have certainly made investments in the ecosystem in the past few months.
And what is the most exciting area of let's say AI for you? Like what are the types of companies that you're really excited about in that space?
Yeah. So one was everything around risk mitigation. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what are the risk frameworks or tools that are going to be needed in order to enable AI. So, 24 months ago, when everybody started talking about generative AI, enterprises loved the concept, but they got really, really scared. And that's when you started to see people just shut down absolute use of ChatGPT and say, we can't risk this, all sorts of things. And so I've been thinking about the risk landscape as it relates to AI for a long time, both from a governance and compliance perspective, where I think we're still early, but also from a pure security perspective. And so one of the investments we made was a Series A investment in a business called Prompt Security, which is doing exactly that. They're trying to secure AI both from a developer perspective, an employee perspective, and an application perspective. So that's a super exciting area of interest for us. And luckily, after a lot of thematic development and a lot of thinking, we were able to make an investment. Um, the other area, especially on the infrastructure side, where I'm spending a lot of time, um, is just modernized data infrastructure. So I don't think this is very novel. A lot of VCs are talking about it. Everybody knows that in order for models to be very powerful, you need as robust and high quality of data as you can have. I think what's been really interesting to learn from talking to CISOs and CTOs, et cetera, the past few months is how unsophisticated even large organizations are in their data management. A lot of them have some type of data observability tool, or they might have these really legacy processes in place where they've built data observability in house. But as the scale of data just increases at an unprecedented rate, they're like, we actually don't think we understand this data as well as we can. We don't think it's of high quality. And that's eventually going to have, downstream effects on the quality of our models and our applications that we're delivering to customers. Um, so there's a couple really interesting companies that are, again, trying to automate a lot of the capabilities around data governance and data quality. So I think the old generation of tools have been very much about elevating insights and elevating anomalies. But if you have a massive number of anomalies, then even elevating them doesn't solve your problem of fixing them. That's a talent constraint and that's a time constraint. And so we're starting to see this next generation of tools that's actually helping to automatically remediate, similarly to the company I talked about, data governance rules. And so they're saying, okay, we can look at all of your historical data. We can generate our own metadata on that and start to auto generate data quality and data governance rules versus your data engineers manually writing thousands of rules for the organization and enforcing them. So I think there's some really foundational elements around the data structure that are interesting. And then the last place on the infrastructure side that I'd say where, again, we actually have made an investment here, but I think there's more room to play is tools that are helping to make the modern software development cycle AI native. And what I mean by that is, historically in a lot of organizations, ML and model development has lived siloed from your application stack because not every model connected to a backend or a front end, not every model translated into an application. And typically it was ML engineers or specialized folks working on model development versus your general software developer. Um, and a thesis that I really believe in is that entire paradigm has shifted, and now all developers are working on ML and AI, and you can't just rely on PhDs to be building models. And that most applications will now be powered by ML AI models. So this is no longer a portion of your workloads; it's almost all of your workloads. So as that happens, I think the silo that's been created between, again, the application stack and the model stack is just going to create a lot of operational bottlenecks. And so there's some interesting tools trying to actually package those together and democratize some of the engineering tasks that used to be limited to ML engineers' capabilities.
That makes total sense. I completely see that as well in the same way. I was wondering though, how does this work from your perspective in a sense of you do you develop the thesis first, like based on your market research, based on your like peer interactions, and then you sort of search for companies that are building in that space, or does it sort of happen that you sort of get a bit of inbound as well, and then you sort of see you get a lot of inbound around a certain topic, so there must be something around it, and then you go deeper. I'm always curious how do you guys think about that?
Yeah, it's definitely both, right? I don't. If we were smart enough to develop 100% of our theses that drive 100% of our investments, we would be really, really good at predicting the future, which is, of course, part of what we're trying to achieve here. But no, I'd say 60 to 70% of the work that we do is thematic. So AI security is a really good example of that, where we have been investors in the risk and the cybersecurity ecosystem for the past 12 years of our fund. And so, because of that, we're constantly talking to CISOs, we're constantly talking to risk officers and understanding what are the next new threat vectors, um, understanding why existing solutions maybe aren't capable of delivering on these new attack vectors. And so that was an example of where we did a lot of market work to inform our perspectives, and that drove our outreach and our sourcing. And we talked to a lot of companies. There are lots of instances, however, where we just get a referral to a really interesting company, either from another VC or cold outbound. We just find a really interesting founder. We start talking to them, and we're like, "Oh, there's something here. Actually, we should start looking into this." Um, a recent example of that, it's not necessarily AI related, but we were looking at a tool selling to solar panel installers. Um, we are not climate investors. We have not historically had any perspective on solar panels, but we saw this business that has had incredible growth rates. And even if that business is not for us, it got us thinking like maybe there's something here, because for a business selling to solar installers to be able to grow at that rate in the past, 12 to 18 months, there's clearly some market demand. So we do use founders, VCs, other companies to inform a good chunk of our thematic
Right.
funnel as well.
Right. So basically, it's like startups trying to get into the market. It's just other way around, right? Sort of when you try to sell, you sort of really try everything, right? As I said, like you go sort of, inbound, outbound, conferences, like network, like all to really get that early customer, typically, right, or a customer. It's like a lot of people don't think of venture capitalists as entrepreneurs, but actually for a lot of VCs, you're actually an entrepreneur of some kind as well, right?
Yeah, I will say, like, we definitely don't have as many of the risks as entrepreneurs do, and the founding journey is much harder. But to your exact point, there is a lot of that creative type of entrepreneurial thinking required. And what is similar is you often don't know the outcome, right? Feedback loops are so long for us as they are for a founder, and you don't actually know if you got your bet or if you even got the market right for a good amount of time.
Yeah, I think it's really the same with the startup, right? Because you get a limited amount of money and you have to place your bets eventually, right? And especially at the early stage, you place a bet, meaning you're gonna burn some money through, and then you only realize, okay, this didn't work out, and now I have half the money available, best case scenario, or even less, right? And what do I do now, right? And it's a little bit the same thing, right? Because you put the thesis there, and then you place investments, and then only even much later you only realize, okay, is this going or not, right? So I think this is similar. It's just different, maybe time spans, and obviously, yeah, just
Hopefully
different kind of
different
risks, right?
hopefully different ratios of right to wrong.
Yeah, exactly,
We're
exactly.
lucky in venture that we're expected to get most things wrong. You hope that founders get most things right,
Right.
a couple things wrong.
But eventually, I mean, depending, how you place your bets, right? There are some startups who do go all in with like one or two bets, but there are some maybe they will play their bets a bit smaller, and eventually, it's also as long as one thing works, right? So you might try 10 iterations of doing something, and then actually the 11th works, and that's it. All you need sometimes, right? So it really depends, I would say. But yeah, but I think you're right. Um, and so going back a little bit to AI, like how a lot of things happened, right? So I don't know, the OpenAI, the ChatGPT launched like 2 years ago, I think.
Yes.
What has happened in those 2 years from your perspective? Like, what have you seen happening from where you sit?
Yeah, that's a loaded question because I think that can go a lot of
I
different.
mean, at least high level, right? I think there were some sort of like waves or patterns or like cycles of some kind, right? That everyone saw. But I'm just curious, like, what kind of, let's say, cycles have you seen?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to talk about this. There's what's happened in the VC and the investment world, and then what we're seeing from an enterprise
Hmm.
adoption perspective.
Yeah.
So I think the enterprise story has been really interesting, and in 2024, I think it has accelerated a clip that I didn't expect it to, from what I had seen last year. So last year, I think there was just a ton of uncertainty. People realized the power of ChatGPT. I don't think they realized the enterprise value of it. And again, that's why a lot of people just shut down its utility. They understood the risks really quickly. They didn't necessarily understand the ROI. And by the way, measuring ROI on AI tools is something that a lot of founders are still struggling with, and a lot of customers are still struggling with. Um, And then there was so much regulatory conversation that emerged so quickly last year, and everybody was like, okay, well, these are going to start being enforced immediately. There's just too many questions right now around business risk, reputational risk, regulatory risk, um, investment risk. Is this worth putting my dollars behind? That we're just going to kind of wait and see. And so you saw a lot of early adopters in this space. You saw a lot of people throw experimental dollars at kind of lower frictioned application layer tools. So like marketing copy tools, right? There's not a ton of risk around that. Um, but you didn't see these broader kind of AI initiatives really emerge in broad strokes until earlier this year, I'd say. And I think ChatGPT and OpenAI did a lot of work to enterprise-ify their product, and other players came to market and they started talking about safety and reliability of models at a level that I think started to get enterprises more comfortable. So what I'd say is I think today we're at this point where a majority of customers or companies have realized that we need AI to stay ahead. Uh, we need to embed it into our business operations, into what we're providing. There's no longer really a question of if, but there's a question of how. And that's being exacerbated because they're getting a bunch of top-down mandates from their board members and their stakeholders saying, "What's your AI strategy?" And so a lot of them have appointed, chief AI officers or heads of AI and allocated just specific AI innovation budgets. And so I think we're definitely like in the heat of that experimental innovation phase. You're seeing a lot of people actually start to rehaul some of their infrastructure, have build versus buy conversations, experimenting with different platforms to build their own agents or AI applications, and a lot more thought and scrutiny being put into the applications, the third party applications that they want to invest in. Um, that being said, I don't think you're seeing as much external AI applications in production yet. And what I mean by that is, I think where a lot of that experimentation, innovation, adoption is happening is for internal use cases. So people really come around to productivity, um, elevating intelligence, making my operations smoother. I think there's still a good amount of hesitation on how am I going to embed AI to serve my customers. You're seeing it happen, especially the startups that are doing that thing. But I think there is still a little bit of a wait and see approach with the largest organizations in especially when it comes to the regulatory frameworks, just because there's been no clarity in that. We haven't seen any of evolution there, just a lot more conversation. Um, so that's kind of how we're seeing the enterprise side evolve. I think there's certain industries, certain use cases, certain functions where there's more appetite than others. There's a little bit more comfort with it, but people are still being very cautious in moving to full production grade environments.
And maybe just one quick question in between. So, what have you seen has happened to the budgets? Like, do you see budgets being carved out specifically for AI? Are they being shifted? Like, what's happening with enterprise budgets for that specifically?
Yeah, we have certainly seen the rise of AI specific budgets. And so there are a lot of people now whose their entire mandate is figure out AI strategy, which on one hand is an exciting signal of aggregate adoption. I actually get very hesitant about companies that are tapping into those budgets because I look at those the way I look at innovation dollars that's actually signaling sustainable revenue in the long term. And that's where you've seen a lot of experimental AI dollars come from. So these companies might get to 1, 2 million ARR pretty quickly, which is not a small feat, but I don't actually know how sticky those dollars are. They're coming from those budgets. Um, so yes, there's a lot of AI budgets, but that's actually not what we're super interested in. Um, the functional budgets haven't changed that dramatically. In fact, most functional budgets are actually getting pulled back. And that's driving need for AI because people are saying I'm being asked to do more with less, but all of the volumes of things that I need to handle within my specific function have gone up. I can't hire more people. And so AI actually makes a lot of sense. And so I do think there's a mentality shift that's happening, but those functional budgets we haven't seen grow specific to AI.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I also see it the same way because it also it's very consistent with then with the sales cycles, right? So I think if someone has a dedicated AI budget, kind of an innovation R&D budget, right, then it's really easy to tap onto that and you can start growing quickly. But how sticky that is, it's a big question. While getting it on an actual budget might take longer, and getting the production can take even longer. But then once you get in there, I mean, the value of the revenue that you can generate is just much higher, right? Because the enterprise really depends on you now, right, and not just like plays with you. And I think for us to see really the outcomes, it's just going to take time, right? Because most of the enterprises, I think you're really right. For most of the enterprises, it's like there's more risk than benefit of jumping on too early. with AI, right? So the ones that have to jump and they say like, okay, if we don't jump onto AI right now, like our business is actually under the risk, right? But if you're like Coca-Cola, I mean, like why do you care about AI, right? Like in the next 5 years, I mean, you're gonna look at it into that, but like what's it going to do to your business really, right? I mean, of course it's a large company, sure they have some use cases, but I mean, it's like then people will still drink Coke, right? I mean, that kind of thing,
Exactly.
right? That's how I
And
also think.
I think there's a lot of like for a company like Coke, there's a lot of low hanging fruit for again like productivity use cases and employee efficiency. But for them to really get it right, they're not going to rely on third party vendors for everything. If they're an organization of this size where they're going to build their own infrastructure, they have on premise systems, and in order to rehaul their infrastructure to be optimized for an AI native organization is a slow burn, right? And they're going to do that thoughtfully and properly, I would hope. And so that's something that is going to take many years to get to a point of advancement than it is today.
But so do you think that enterprises will actually start building their own AI applications, or like how do you generally see that? Like at what level would they pick up? Because they're not going to build obviously their LLMs, right? They're going to take existing LLMs, like, and there's going to be some wrappers around it. So where do you feel like it? Which level that they're going to pick up on?
It's a good question. And I think it really depends. I think there are specific verticals, highly complex, highly regulated verticals, where, again, most of their systems are on prem. They do have more control and ownership over their software development, their data, that are going to start at the infrastructure level. And they're the ones that are going to say, we have dedicated AI teams, we have dedicated ML teams that might be composed of general software developers, but they're tasked with these initiatives and they need the most optimal infrastructure in order to go build and test against that. Otherwise, it's just going to be way too expensive to outsource, right? I think that's like healthcare, robotics, defense, even financial services, right? And these are also the industries and the types of companies that have a proclivity to try to build anything before they buy it because they have the resourcing. And that's been true for many years. And now what's happening is the barriers to building have come down with LLMs. And so I think that conversation is going to come up more and more, and it's going to put more pressure on vendors to again prove the ROI. So I think you are going to see a good chunk of enterprise customers start to adopt the infrastructure layer. But then there's going to be a lot of these either mid-market or technology forward companies that do adopt third-party applications. Um, However, I think even in those cases, the two places that you have to build an internal processor system or up level is around security and risk and around data. And so the more third party applications you introduce, the more third party risk you have. Third party risk is something that all CISOs are talking about right now. There's all these new threat vectors that are being introduced, and the volume of those applications has increased really rapidly. And so, even so, people are still trying to rehaul their security programs internally as it relates to AI. And then, second, again, in order to have that many applications and actually deliver value from them, you need to feed it your data. You need to allow them to integrate with your systems. And that in itself is a management process as well. And so while you might not see them entirely rehaul core infrastructure like you're seeing some of these other companies do, I think you'll still see a lot of movement within certain functional areas. Um, and then the last kind of bucket of folks is SMBs. I mean, SMBs have been some of the first to adopt AI, and that's because they can just go and adopt applications pretty quickly, and they honestly have the most to gain from it. They're, especially in like services industries, legacy industries, these are low margin organizations that have so much to gain from a customer engagement, customer efficiency perspective, but also a back office perspective. And those are also most of the industries where there's just massive talent shortages and a ton of burnout happening. And so you've seen actually the biggest rise in AI application adoption at the SMB layer because they're never going to go and build any of this in house,
Yeah,
and so
makes
they've been
sense.
able to throw dollars really quickly.
Right. Yeah. So you just need a ready solution, and maybe that's really gonna be the place where AI startups have also the biggest opportunity, right? Because enterprise sales is gonna be complicated, as you said, for the reasons mentioned, right?
Yeah, that's
And
actually something we've seen a lot of. Sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say it's been really interesting in the past 18 months. A lot of the traditional SaaS tools that we've looked at that are now AI applications, they are selling to SMBs. And I think it's been interesting, historically, a lot of VCs see something selling to SMBs and they immediately, it's a red flag. They say we don't even invest in things selling to SMBs. And that mentality has shifted a lot, I think, because it has to. But you've seen a lot more. people get behind companies where their core customer base is largely small organizations.
Yeah, yeah, I think it really makes a lot of sense with AI. I mean, I totally can see that because it can also scale so quickly, right? When there's like an application for, as you said, as a like mid-sized SaaS company or customer-oriented business, and it just works, and then everyone's going to pick it up very quickly, right? Because also it's that the barrier to entry or like to introduce new technologies is quite low there, right? Um, and you also mentioned that a lot of enterprises are still on prem. How do you see AI impacting cloud adoption overall? Like, what is your take on that? Because cloud is great, but obviously it's still very expensive, and doing AI in the cloud is like ultra expensive. We've at least seen that a lot of people are doing that mostly obviously on prem, buying actual hardware, like using collocating things in actual data centers, right? Like, what is your take on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And while I think the data center demand is certainly surging, I think the hard part about that, especially for the traditional organization that is not building foundational models, et cetera, is that there's just not enough energy in this country to power the data centers that are in demand, right? And so there's a lot of conversation happening around supplements to the electrical grid and investing in nuclear power and things like that, which is a whole different, very interesting area of investment. And so while logically that makes sense to do for some organizations, if you have the resourcing, I think there's just a lot of constraints from a supply side. So instead, I think there's a couple different elements we're seeing. I think one, we're seeing more companies experiment with kind of these smaller cloud CSPs
Yeah,
or hybrid CSPs,
yeah,
multi-cloud
like a
CSPs.
GPU dedicated
Mhm.
CSP. Yeah,
And like this idea of a multi-cloud environment has again been talked about for 10 years. And then when we
yeah,
actually dove into it, like that transition has been very slow. I actually think AI is fueling that a little bit because every CSP, every point in time is coming out with their build. They have a new hardware that they acquired, or they have a new cost structure that they've been able to achieve. And also, most of the CSPs today lock you in. To their specific native models, right? Or their native models are the ones that it's easier to test with, like that. And so that's also driving a shift for people to say, well, I want to be able to play with Vertex and all of AWS's models and everything out there. And so I actually need this hybrid environment or this multi-cloud environment to have optimal services for all of it. So I do think there are some interesting cost optimization and model optimization techniques that are happening that are driving people to be multi-cloud due to AI. And so that's one element of cloud services. Um, I also think people are just putting a lot more scrutiny on their cloud allocation and their cloud cost optimization tactics than they were prior. And cloud cost optimization has been around for decades. Like IBM Turbonomic and all of those tools have been around for so long, but they have been very, very catered towards engineers, and they have been pretty hard to drill into at a granular level. Like it takes some real configuration to actually understand what's needed there. And I think that's an area of investment that has entirely shifted, where now it's your finance leaders, it's other people within the organization saying, I need to understand my cloud costs because it's not just impacting my R&D teams anymore, it's actually impacting everyone, and I need to understand it at a customer level. And so how people are thinking about unit economics at the customer level is changing, because they might be saying, okay, we actually don't want to serve this size customer anymore because what we're serving them is more expensive than the revenue we're generating. Um, and again, I think just a deeper level of visibility and granularity is now required. So there's this whole slew of kind of these cloud cost tools that have come up that are trying to provide that layer of visibility across multiple different systems, across multiple different cloud providers and tools, the Databricks, the Snowflakes,
right.
and
And
do
same,
that.
same with the security, right? So observability and security, those are. I mean, I'm really deep in. I mean, we are a cloud infrastructure startup, right? And we see when you go to a conference, basically, you have two main themes typically, which is observability and security, right? Because as you said, within a single cloud, that's less of a topic. But if you have multiple clouds, multiple environments, security and observability are the main two things you really need to sort out, followed by probably your data infrastructure or your data movements, right? But generally, that's the case because it's hard enough to sort of figure out where is your AWS money going. But then if you have like three clouds of that kind, then it's like actually more than three times as hard, right? Because it's really complex, right? To figure out what you actually need, what you don't need, and
Yeah.
where is the loophole, right?
That's exactly right. I think AI is driving more proliferated cloud environments. And the more proliferated of a cloud environment you get, the more tooling you need to understand that environment. Um, and maybe over time, one or two of the CSPs will emerge as having an advantage. But I think right now it's kind of just a race to the bottom. And they're all competing with each other at such a rapid clip that most organizations can't afford to make their bet on just one CSP unless there's kind of meaningful incentive or advantage there.
Yeah, exactly. So I think eventually that what's gonna happen, and what's also our thesis is that like sort of the playground will level out a little bit, meaning it's gonna be much easier. Also, there's gonna be a lot of technologies like including ours, hopefully, that will sort of make abstract the cloud from you. So you're going to be able, like, you have Kubernetes, right, for obviously workload orchestration. You're going to have technologies for storage, technologies for networking, which are sort of standard based, and that let you really switch back and forth between clouds very easily. And then obviously on top of you have all those sort of UI based tools that actually let you also do it, abstract the cloud from you in sort of from the top, right? So once the cloud is abstracted from the bottom and from the top, you can really actually move stuff around more easily. And it's only about cloud providers killing their sort of egress fees for getting data out of their clouds, which I think also might happen, because already a lot of cloud providers started doing that because they see that the market doesn't really want that, right? So I think there will be a lot of pressure on all kinds of cloud providers to make things more standardized, right? But of course there will be still, they still need to take care of their business. So they, from like, let's say, AWS perspective, or from individual cloud providers perspective, they will obviously do as much as they can to lock you in with all kinds of managed services, right, including the AI models and AI services, which would be somewhat proprietary for sure, right? But
Yeah, that's what I was going to hit on a little bit. Is what's going to be really interesting to see is how the legacy CSPs become more and more competitive with the new infrastructure startups that are coming up. Because as the core cloud services become commoditized, again, it's a race to the bottom from pricing. They are going to need to add all of these other value additive tooling around it, and you're already seeing that happening with all of the big cloud providers. And so the more and more they roll out those services, the more and more challenging it becomes for new upstarts to say, well, why can't the incumbent do this? Or are they already? So that'll be an interesting dynamic to kind of watch over the next 12 months. Is where do we still think there's opportunity for new players to come in versus what are the big players just going to be really good at?
yeah, exactly. Because like I think that a lot of those CSPs emerged just because there was a huge shortage of GPUs, right? And I feel like we're past that a little bit. So I think GPUs are much more available right now, and the prices keep going down, and probably there's a lot of underutilization there already. Yeah, I mean, if that's not going to differentiate you, that you actually have GPUs versus others don't, like, then you actually need to build all that stack that AWS already has, which they've built over 20 years. So how do you compete with that, right? It's I think it's a valid point, but it's a completely different space. um, all right. I mean, I think I still had a couple of questions, on the AI front. I mean, have you seen things not working out within the AI startup so far? Like, have you seen something that seemed so hot, a year ago, but now you sort of realize, okay, this is not going to work with AI, or actually AI is not changing that fundamentally, or it's still too early to tell?
I think for a lot of things, the answer is going to be it's too early. I mean, one thing that I think I got wrong last year was around AI governance and compliance. And so, not security, but I spent a lot of time thinking about new GRC frameworks and really believed, there's a ton of integrated GRC platforms that already exist. From talking to them and from talking to risk officers, like, really believed there needed to be a net new platform for AI governance. And there's a lot of those tools that have emerged and seen some nice customer traction. But I think the actual regulatory environment has just moved a lot slower than I anticipated. And I last year had this thesis that people would start to adopt these governance solutions towards the beginning of 24, middle of 24, to prepare for what's going to come in 25, 26. Because there's a lot of organizations that are just incredibly risk averse and will be early adopters. And then there's a bunch that'll wait. But I thought that like early adopter market was big enough. And that's moved a lot slower than I expected, especially compared to how much faster the adoption has been than I expected. And so that's certainly something that I got wrong that I don't think that I think has been really challenging for a lot of AI governance companies to scale and really deliver the ROI because enforcement just isn't happening yet. And again, there's such a lack of clarity on the regulatory front that what they're building their product against is a little bit unclear. Um, so that's something that I think is not working today, but I think they'll market for it eventually. The other areas, like there's just been a lot of these horizontal AI tools pop up that I don't think have sustainable moats. A great area to talk about is like the marketing copy space. So again, there was a ton of these that came to market last year that were just producing content for you. And people threw money at them because ChatGPT and OpenAI wasn't good enough at it or wasn't trusted enough at it at that point in order to do it at the enterprise level. And I think that's shifted. And there are some of those companies that continue to do well because they have great leadership or great distribution strategies. But from like the core product perspective, or if one of those companies were to emerge today, I don't think they'd work. I think where most people are investing their time is largely around specific verticalized applications. And then there's some functional areas where I think AI is necessary. Um, and then to that note, I think there's also a lot of verticals where generative AI is not needed or warranted. And so I think because this concept of vertical AI has been talked about so much in the past few quarters, and all VCs are saying they want to invest behind vertical AI, et cetera, I think a lot of founders just started building things for verticals they knew, but not every vertical is big enough or complex enough to mandate a specific solution either. So um, there's some of those that I don't think are working. Like where we're really focusing our time is again very legacy industries or complex industries, but there's some that I think traditional automation is good enough, at least for the next few years. And so um, those are maybe some thoughts, but again, I think broad strokes it's a little bit early to say, and I'll probably be wrong about a lot of this in 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, like everyone around, right? Like no one knows. I think that's the point. That's why it's so hard to regulate because no one knows, right? So like if founders like don't know, if VCs don't know, like how can regulators know, right? Like what's gonna happen? So I think that's why it's a little bit hard to also figure that out. And where is the VC market right now? So maybe one more question from my side. Like what's happening in the VC world? So is like AI overall still really the main theme? What are the funding conditions like overall? Would you say it's hot, cold, somewhere in between? Like compared to that, because there's been quite a roller coaster in the last couple of years, especially since COVID. So we're really curious to hear your take on that.
I think AI has helped fuel a lot more investment excitement and kind of helped a lot of VCs come out of what was a pretty dry spell of time in terms of investment areas. And so I think there's this like resurgence of excitement in the industry that was needed after, a couple um, hard quarters or hard years. Um, so from a almost emotional perspective, I think AI has been really good for the VC world. That being said, I think a lot of the numbers and the stories you see out there aren't actually reflective of always what I'm hearing from people on the ground. And what I mean is, I think like over a third of US funding dollars this year has been towards AI companies. It's close to like $60 billion last quarter. So by all means, a massive amount of the dollars in the VC world are going towards AI companies. And that's not even really considering all of the ancillary AI products, so cloud infrastructure and things like that. Not just core AI. However, I think like a third of those are characterized by deals over $1 billion, um, like CoreWeave or Databricks or OpenAI. And so those mega deals in the infrastructure space are, I think, propping up a lot of the funding figures and the growth that we're seeing. And a lot of those are happening from a concentrated set of VCs. I mean, first of all, there's only a concentrated set of VCs that can do those types of rounds. And then you're also seeing a lot of the tech incumbents like Microsoft and Nvidia and Amazon come in and prop up those rounds as well. And so all that's creating this huge signal that AI is getting all the funding and it's sucking the air out of the room, which conversationally it might be, but from a funding perspective, I think it's still pretty concentrated from the number of people that are actually doing a high number of deals. Um, when you actually talk to VCs on the ground, everybody's obviously thinking about AI and trying to formulate their perspective. But most of the people that I talk to and the deals that they're looking at are not, AI native. And there's very few people that I'm talking to where their mandate is AI. They're like, I'm looking at these 4 or 5 things. Of course, AI is one part of it, or I'm thinking about how AI can enable this function or this vertical. But not a lot of people are just saying, I'm just trying to invest in AI, at least from my purview. Again, I think there's definitely VCs who are doing that, and there's investors that have come out and just created AI funds, which, to be honest, I struggle with a little bit because I think in a couple of years it'll just be a software fund, which is what most of us are doing. But I think they all have their mandates and their approaches for different reasons. But I do think you have to disaggregate a little bit what's being put out there and the absolute numbers from like true volume and true kind of bulk of investors. Um, but yeah, it's definitely been exciting to be part of this curve. And at the end of the day, like funding dollars aside, I do think what everybody is starting to appreciate, if they haven't already, is that this is a fundamentally kind of like life-changing technology, and we're starting to see not only its impact on business and new organizations, but on kind of society as we know it. And I think that's a really interesting movement to be a part of, whether you're the ones throwing $2 billion at a company or not.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so much bigger than just like a VC and startup world, right? That we see obviously a lot of governments being interested in funding those technologies as well, and or owning those technologies, right? So yeah, I think it's just going to be part of our life, right? So as you rightly said, we might not call it AI anymore. We're going to go back to what's been there
Yep.
before, because it's just really something that's just gonna be there, and you just, yeah, like no one says, "Oh, I'm funding internet companies," right, anymore, because internet is just taken for granted, right?
It is what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool, great, Saya. I mean, from my side, that's all the questions I had. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience, yourself, and where to find you, what to follow, and etc.
No, this was great. Thank you so much for having me. You can find me on most of the socials. I check my LinkedIn pretty frequently. I put a bunch of my content and insights on our website, jumpcap.com. I'm always open to cold outreach, and I always love just hearing other people's perspectives. I mean, this is a category where I think the only way that you can stay smart on it is if you try to get as many diverse viewpoints as possible from as many stakeholders as possible, because it's just moving at a rate that we can't keep up otherwise. And so I love when people tell me, "Hey, I think you're wrong about this," or "I have a different perspective." I love debating this category, and so super open to all those conversations, and hopefully, I'm pretty easy to find.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much for your time, and all the best in the new year,
Thank you, Rob.
with investing.
You too.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed our discussion. Cloud Frontier is brought to you by SimplyBlock, an intelligent database storage orchestrator. Get more IAPS and lower latency for your databases in the cloud. Visit our website at simplyblock.io for more information.